Welcome students, I'm Dr. Sonu Shiva, Associate Professor, Department of English, Government Junior College, Bikaner. This session is for MA final year English Literature paper 8A, that is New Literatures in English. In this paper you have a fiction, Shadow Lines by Amitav Ghosh. And before dealing with that fiction, I'll be talking about diasporic consciousness in this session, referring here and there to Amitav Ghosh, Shadow Lines. As in my introductory session, I have already talked about Ghosh as an Indian Bengali writer who belongs to diasporic community. We come to know that diasporic writings, immigration, loneliness, alienation, all these things, they hold a great place. If you look at the origin of the word diaspora, we come to know that it is derived from Greek language, which means scattering of seeds. Just like seeds are scattered, in the same way, people are scattered throughout the globe. It is used to describe population, migration, and dispersal. Diaspora can be referred to people migrating from one country to another country due to various reasons. Diasporic writing occupies a place of great significance between country and culture, because somewhere diasporic literature acts as a bridge between two different cultures, as it commonly deals with the memories of home and experience of the immigrants in the host country with their native culture. Diasporic writing mostly becomes a response to the lost homes and to issues such as dislocation, nostalgia, discrimination, survival, cultural change, and identity. So all these are the issues that are related to diasporic writing. Dislocation is one of the first feelings that haunt the diasporic community, because one is dislocated from one's country and there is a settlement into a new geographical space and culture. When diasporic people find themselves dislocated from home society, they are upset mentally and strive to remember and locate themselves in nostalgic past. So this can be seen in diasporic literature and the mental condition of the people. But when we look at the writings of Amitav Ghosh, as he is one of the important diasporic writers, he tries to capture all the consciousness of diasporic community in his writing. And we find that his approach towards this migration is unique, because he never directs his characters towards the loss on the foreign country. Instead, what we see in his work is that he observes the experimental lives and gives a positive touch to this immigration. We see that his novels are always in search of the root cause of migration, though that doesn't come to our view, but he opens the past in his fiction and re-examines every socio-political activity, and he tries to expose the actual effect of on common people and their migration in his fiction. Coming to the history of diaspora, Indian diaspora specifically, the Indian diasporic history can be broadly divided into three major phases on the motive of their migration. So there are multiple motives why people have migrated from this country. The first phase started during the colonial time, particularly in the latter half of 19th century. During that time, the first type of immigration that started in the later half of 19th century, many of the uneducated Indian indentured laborers left their homeland to work in the sugar, rubber, and tea plantations of the British colonies. So this was migration for laborers in search of jobs in British colonies. In the mid-20th century, the second phase of migration took place. In this phase, what we saw was that educated Indians started moving towards the developed nations, especially to the West, for the economic development and educational prospects. The third phase of migration occurred in the beginning of 21st century, when many of Indians, including the educated as well as the uneducated. So in 21st century, we find that the educated people as well as the uneducated people, they went to developed nations in search of employment and earning. So these are the three phases of Indian diasporic history, and the writers have written from the characters belonging to these three stages of migration. Journey is somewhere closely related with migration. This journey can be outward, where a person is migrating from one geographical space to another geographical space, and this journey can also be inward, where it's a journey towards self-realization, self-recognition, self-knowledge, and self-definition. Because we see that almost all the diasporic communities face initial problems and sufferings when they settle into this new land. Though they try to adjust into the new environment, language, culture, and society, they suffer from psychological problems of alienation, identity crisis, loneliness, rootlessness, dislocation, nostalgia, cultural change, gender inequality, racism, homelessness, etc. So all these issues, they are related to the people who immigrate, and the way they try to adjust into this new environment, because we see that some of these immigrants, they suppress their recollections and they passively allow these recollections to be submerged into their consciousness, and among some of these immigrants, they try to keep themselves updated with this reality, and they keep on extending their visit to their home country, and in this way they try to somehow balance this in-betweenness. Diasporic sensibility is not something permanent. It keeps on changing as time and place changes. The evolution of diasporic sensibility is in terms of its continually changing consciousness, and expatriate writing is not only the nostalgic reminiscing of a place but also of time. So with this passage of time, we see that migrant becomes a very keen observer, and he becomes a very critical participant and develops a powerful insight into this insider and outsider dichotomy, and then he somehow feels and writes about the real lived experiences of migration. So time leads to the development of groups and subgroups within diaspora, and this insider-outsider dichotomy, there is observation and participation of these immigrants with the time in this. Nostalgia. Nostalgia is related to immigration very closely. Diasporic condition is the state in which longing and yearnings of the migrants are expressed. So because they have immigrated, so they have a longing and yearning for their roots. The concept of diaspora stands steadfast in its claims towards the inevitability of nostalgia. So nostalgia is something which is inevitable. It is going to be there whenever a person leaves his homeland. Nostalgia has always been a useful compensatory tool to construct an alternative historical reality created by the images of golden past, especially when there is a discontent with the present socio-economic situation in any culture. So whenever there is any sort of a discontent or any sort of a problem which arises in this new situation or culture, person always creates images from the golden past. Amitav Ghosh fiction is expressive of an urge to find a context in which characters try to transform the meaningless routine of life into a sensuous construct. A nostalgic sentiment comes handy to Ghosh to fill the narrative gaps that inevitably arise in the novel. So what we see is that Ghosh writings, they replicate the current concern of cultural boundaries. The characters in his fiction, they cross the borders, and they dwell in distant cultures, but they travel in cultural spaces that flow across the borders. So you don't find them just sticking to one culture, but there is a flow in them when they travel in these cultural spaces. We also see that Amitav Ghosh, he shows a keen interest in projecting diasporic life. So many of his narratives focus on the histories of exodus and individual diasporic experiences that fills both the structure and texture in the novels. So his novels are structured and the content of his novels are in such a way that they focus on the histories of exodus. The blend of history and anthropology in Ghosh novels helps him to bring out the present of the past in many aspects, including diaspora. So he blends history and anthropology in his work. He views the wars, politics, economy, and other worldly affairs from the perspective of common people who suffer under all these major events and changes. So you see that how political becomes personal and how it affects the routine life of common people. The term displacement has got a vast connotation with respect to diasporic literature, which involves the theme of homeland, a place from where displacement took place, and the narratives of tough journeys undertaken because of the economic compulsions. So the characters or the people do take up journeys because of economic compulsions, but the journey is not that easy. This displacement has a lot of emotional, psychological and other things of self and community and society involved. So this term displacement, it has a vast connotation, and all these issues one finds reflected in diasporic literature. Element of Indianness. In Amitav Ghosh writing, there is an element of Indianness. He represents migrant lives in his novels, but his articulation is his own when he talks about this diasporic consciousness in his writings. He has his own way of putting things across. There are many different ways for diasporas to look back at their homelands. In the works of other writers, they have chosen their own strategy, their own style to look at homeland in their own ways. But when we talk about Ghosh, he glanced at his homeland and its spirit by writing it in his novels. His novels, in all aspects, reflect his closeness towards his motherland, and Indian elements in his novels have drawn the attention of many conscious readers and critics. There is a lot of Indian element which is there, and we are going to have a look about this Indianness in his works. Simultaneously, his practice of using Indian loan words in English. So whenever he is writing, he does use words from Indian culture and something which is from his homeland into this English, and he lends importance to the aspect of its Indianness to some extent. Ghosh adoption of many Indian words and terms into English, as well as use of many Bengali expressions in his text, thus indicate how the spirit of India interwoven with the content of his text. So we see that a lot of Indian words and a lot of Bengali expressions are interwoven in his text, and these memories of homeland are sometimes his own experience of the past, and in many times the things that he's expressing in his writing might be narrated by the ancestors. So but we see that there is a lot of Indianness and Indian element in terms of language, in terms of expression, in terms of experience, which is reflected in his work. When we look at his work, Shadow Lines, we see that Amitav Ghosh explores the political and economic growth of India through the lives of two families, Bengali and English. So this fiction is about the life of two families, Bengali family and English family. This novel captures perspective of time and events that bring people together and holds them apart. That what brings these families together and what makes them apart. The novel has an unnamed narrator relating the story of his experience and his uncle Fridib's experiences. Fridib in this fiction is considered to be the protagonist of the novel. Ghosh novel is useful resource to study both the challenges of diaspora as well as strategies of negotiation. He uses personal stories to shed light on social, political and historical. The characters keep turning back to homeland, its sacredness, rituals, cultures, thus adopt various family symbols to help them freeze the image of homeland and their being. So the story is about these two families, Indian and English, and we also see in it the difference of culture, geographical structures. He discusses that, and the boundary line between nation and family is shown to the reader. And then there is a quest for self-identity, which is there in the characters. And the characters in the novel are caught between these two nations and a struggle to come of their artificiality, self-made personalities due to influence of migration. So we can say that this Shadow Line is a novel which is considered as very successful because of its powerful imagination. And we see there is a lot of imagination which is involved in both Tridib and narrator. Both are good in this dominant feature. So thanks for this session, and in my next session we will be focusing more on shadow lines and the issues directly related to this fiction of Amitav.